All right, welcome back. Let's talk about the endocrine system in this video. The nervous system and the endocrine system are very closely related. They both control and coordinate body functions and adapt it to constantly changing stresses of its surroundings. The nervous system is fast acting and short lived, with electrical currents traveling through the nerves before releasing a chemical altering a target cell's function. The chemical in the nerve is that neurotransmitter, and a function changes, for example, contracting a muscle. The endocrine system, on the other hand, is slow acting and long lasting, which is great for ongoing processes like growth and reproduction. In that system, the cells secrete chemicals into the bloodstream. So they don't send electrical signals down a nerve and then the chemical is secreted right at the end of the nerve. Here, we're going to secrete the hormone into the bloodstream by the cells that secrete it. And then that hormone travels through the body until it binds to a specific receptor on a target cell that promotes a reaction. And you can see that right here. You can see how the secreting cell secretes the hormone, this blue dot here, and then the target cell has a receptor on it that receives that matches to that hormone, and then that creates a reaction inside the cell. Hormones secretion is heavily controlled by deep cell brain structures, the hypothalamus in particular. Exocrine glands also secrete substances, but they secrete their substances directly via ducts to the external and internal body surfaces. External body surfaces are the skin, for example, and internal body surfaces are the gastrointestinal tract because it's opened by the mouth, and so therefore it's topologically speaking the outside of the world. And so you can see that here where we have a exocrine gland that secretes its substances to the outside here of the skin surface. And then in the endocrine gland, we secrete the substances, the chemicals into the bloodstream. Hormones are either dissolvable in water or they're oily. When they're dissolvable, we call them hydrophilic, water loving. And when they're oily, we call them hydrophobic. They separate out. Hydrophilic ones can't penetrate the cell membrane, that oil film that gets created with the phospholipid bilayer. And they need to bind to receptors on the surface of the cell. And then this then starts a chain reaction and relaying the message to the cells inside, triggering a reaction in the cell. And you can see that right up here where a peptide hormone, that's a hydrophilic hormone, it's an amino acid based hormone, gets to a receptor on the outside of the cell. And then that second messenger goes to the inside and does the change in the cell's action. A hydrophobic hormone can pass straight through the cell to the interior and bind to a receptor directly inside the cell, changing the function of the cell directly. And that's a steroid hormone, is a oily hormone, a hydrophobic hormone, and that can go directly through the cell membrane and make a change on the inside. And very often, that's a gene expression. For example, we make a protein out of something or an enzyme. The number of receptors determines a cell's sensitivity. A rise in hormone levels, especially over time, influences how many receptors a cell makes. Cells making less receptors, they downregulate and become less sensitive. And that, for example, happens when we expose the cells to a lot of sugar, and the insulin tells the sugar to go into the cells, but the insulin receptors to glucose exposure get numbed and they get less reactive. Hormones that trigger cells making more receptors, they upregulate and they get more sensitive. And that, for example, happens with oxytocin receptors in the uterus during the third trimester, and that then facilitates uterine contractions during labor. Endocrine glands exclusively secrete hormones, but other glands can also have secretory cells. For example, the heart and the kidney regulate blood volume. Kidney also regulate the red blood cell production, and the gastrointestinal tract has hormones that secretes to aid digestion, for example. Even muscle secretes hormones depending if they're active or they're inactive, influencing functions such as blood sugar levels and blood pressure and so forth. Hormone secretion is largely regulated by that negative feedback mechanism, balancing blood levels of many substances. And those are like blood glucose, for example, or blood calcium. And you can see the example right up here. You have the balance here. That's the homeostasis. And if, let's say, we have blood sugar goes up, we have an elevated glucose. We have then the pancreas that secretes insulin. That's the hormone that brings the glucose into the cells, and that lowers the blood glucose and balances out the homeostasis again, or the blood sugar level. And the same is, of course, when the glucose is too low, then the pancreas secretes glucagon, and the liver mostly elevates the blood glucose by breaking down glycogens. And we have chemoreceptors that measure those levels and instruct glands to either release and inhibit then the hormones. Many receptors are in the hypothalamus, which is that deep brain structure that we can see right here, the hypothalamus. It then sends either releasing or inhibiting hormones, liberins or statins, they call them, to the attached pituitary gland, directing it of what to do. And here you can see the pituitary gland. It's sitting down down in here. And then that one's attached to the bloodstream. It in turn then influences many peripheral glands and tissues directly through a bunch of its hormones. And you can see down in here the hypothalamus, how it has inhibiting and releasing hormone that then in turn control the hypothalamus at the anterior pituitary is action, and then that in turn secretes hormones that controls the target organs or the systemic target organs as well as the glands actions. And so we have multiple steps of control that we can put in, and you know, hormones are extremely sensitive and they're very powerful chemicals, so we need to assure that the stuff goes right and we don't secrete too many or too few. So this then gives the brain, this hypothalamus structure gives the brain the overriding organizational control over the endocrine system as a whole. Of course, not all of it is controlled that way. A lot of it is also directly controlled, like the blood sugar with the negative feedback mechanism. But a lot of it is going through the brain structure. And then the pituitary gland, the hypophysis, in itself then has two lobes to it. And one of them, the neurohypophysis, the posterior lobe, is made of nerve endings from the hypothalamus. And you can see that visualized up here where we have the hypothalamus, and then that has direct nerve fibers actually going to the posterior pituitary gland. It secretes antidiuretic hormone, which reabsorbs water in the kidneys, increasing blood volume, and then that increases the blood pressure, or influences the blood pressure. And you can feel that hormone after you drink coffee or after you drink alcohol, or the lack of it working, because that's when you have to go to the bathroom all the time, because it's the anti-diuretic, the anti-pee hormone is not doing its anti, so you're going to have to go pee. So that's how I always remember that. The oxytocin promotes uterine contractions during labor and milk ejection during breastfeeding. Oxytocin is the other hormone that's made in the hypothalamus, but then released in the posterior pituitary gland. It also helps us feel affectionate. So besides the uterine contraction, the milk ejections, it's also known as the cuddle hormone. The adenohypophysis, I got to go down a little bit, that secretes so many hormones, as you can see there. That's the anterior lobe. Adeno refers to hormone. And one of them, for example, is the growth hormone. And it targets bone and muscle cells, and that stimulates cell growth and cell division. So that makes us grow. That's why it's the growth hormone. Prolactin is another hormone, and that stimulates the production of milk by the mammary gland. And then the other hormones regulate different glands, and you can see them all right visualized in here. Some of them are the follicle stimulating hormone, or the FSH, acts um, on the gonads and helps maturation of the ovarian follicles and sperm production. The luteinizing hormone, called LH, luteinizing LH, initiates ovulation in women and enhances testosterone in men. And then the adrenocorticotropic hormone enhances secretion in the adrenal cortex, and thyroid stimulating hormone, the TSH, enhances the secretion of the thyroid gland. When we then go to the individual glands, we're going to go first to the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is located below the larynx in the front of the neck, right around here. It is a butterfly-shaped gland with two lobes connected by an isthmus, they call that. It secretes thyroxine, which has 4 iodine atoms attached to it, or triiodothyronine, which has 3 attached. So they call that short T4 and T3. Makes it a little easier. But both of those stimulate enzymes concerned with energy production. So we're talking about glucose oxidation in most, and that does do that in most body cells. So those hormones attach to most body cells, and then the energy production goes up, and this increases the basal metabolic rate and the body heat production as well. And so that's why we call it also a calorigenic effect. Calorigenic effect. What a difficult word for me to pronounce. The thyroid the thyroid gland also secretes calcitonin, and calcitonin does not work on the energy production. Calcitonin works on the calcium blood level, and so it helps balance the blood calcium level by lowering it. Blood calcium is very important. It has to be leveled very, very narrow, in a very narrow range. So it's one of those things we need to really measure. And so calcitonin helps lower it when it goes too high. And you can see that right here. Let me see if I can visualize that. So see here, it's too high, and calcitonin tones it down, the blood calcium level. That's how I remember it. And it does that by bringing calcium into the bone, by decreasing uptake of calcium, and also by decreasing reabsorption of calcium in the urine. And then the calcium levels fall, and we're back to this homeostasis. That's that negative feedback loop that we talked previously about. And then to oppose that, we have 4 lentil-shaped parathyroid glands on the backside of the thyroid gland, and they secrete parathyroid hormone. And then that raises the blood calcium level, opposing the calcitonin's effect. And you can see that right in here, how we have the parathyroid. This is the backside. You see these 4 dots right here? Those are the parathyroid glands. And they secrete the parathyroid hormone, and that then increases the release, because we need to bring the blood calcium up. So we want to take calcium from the bone, and then also we take up more calcium and reabsorb more calcium, so we keep as much retained as possible in the system. And this is actually an interesting point with this calcium in the bone, because if we think of bone being a reservoir for calcium, if we are young people, as we build the bone, we want to build as much good calcium bone as possible, because as we get older, we drain it out and we leach it. And that's when very old people sometimes get osteoporosis, because there's not enough left, and it makes the bone more brittle. And so that's something to consider. And they call that, because of that, they call that a juvenile disease with an adult onset. The adrenal gland sits on top of each kidney. They have an outer thick cortex and a deep medulla. The cortex secretes 3 types of hormones. We have aldosterone, which is a main mineral corticoid, and that absorbs sodium by the kidneys, which retains water, since water follows sodium. And again, like before, if you want to visualize that water follows sodium thing, slice a tomato, put some salt on it, and come back a couple minutes later, and the salt crystal is probably a water droplet at that point. So it draws it out. So that's important to always remember in the body. Water follows salt. Then we also have cortisol, the main glucocorticoid, and that's a long-term stress hormone that assures the cell's glucose level. So we have a proper energy. And it also reduces inflammation and suppresses the immune system. So if we are in a stressful situation, we can respond to the stress and don't have the body other problems drag us down. Of course, that can also be a problem. We don't want to be under too long-term stress because it decreases the immune system. Androgens, the testosterone mainly, is secreted in a small amount in the kidneys, in the cortex. Most of it is secreted by the male in the testes, and that stimulates protein metabolism, muscle buildup. And this testosterone, both the male and the female body get. So the female also has some little amounts of testosterone. The adrenal medulla, then, that inside of the adrenal gland, secretes epinephrine, which is the adrenaline, and norepinephrine, which is noradrenaline. They were close with the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is that nervous system that gets activated when you need to have a fight or flight response, when you need to react to a situation that's sort of dangerous. And that is secreted during that to then immediately respond to that stress and give increased energy. And the hypothalamus is who directs that. And you can see that here, how the spinal cord actually sends the nerves down, and then the adrenal medulla secretes the hormone. This is a classic place where you can also see how the nervous system and the endocrine systems work very closely together. And you can understand also the difference between the nervous system and the endocrine system. I think I said it before in the course, where you're going down the freeway and somebody cuts you off and you swerve out very fast. That's the nervous system, the fast acting thing. And then slowly the adrenaline trickles into the bloodstream, and that gives you sort of the jittery feeling. A half a minute, or slowly means a half a minute or so. It's not that slow. And then that's the adrenaline working. That's the endocrine system part working. So that gives you a little bit of that quickness idea in your own body. All right. The pancreas is another one that we need to talk about. That's an interesting one. It is embraced by the duodenum and secretes the digestive enzymes, which is the pancreatic juice, into the duodenum. And that is actually an exocrine function. So that's that outside world, or the intestinal tube is sort of the outside world. The endocrine cells, this also has endocrine cells on the pancreas. The pancreatic islands are called also islets of Langerhans, they also call them. And in them, alpha cells produce glucagon and beta cells produce insulin. And you can see here, the pancreas is right here. And it's sort of, this is the duodenum right here. So it's the duodenum sort of embraces it. So let's see how that works with that blood sugar. So if the blood sugar is high, insulin promotes cellular glucose uptake and storage. And we store the insulin in the liver as glycogen, or also in fat, the excess glucose. And then if the glucose level is low, on the other hand, we can get glucagon, and the glucagon mobilizes energy reserves by breaking down glycogen, and also form glucose from other macromolecules. And it's interesting, these words, look at that. We say breaking down glycogen, we see glycogenolysis. So the lysis is the breakdown word. And then when we make glucose from other molecules, we say that gluco, and then we say neo from new, genesis, creation. So that's another interesting word, gluconeogenesis. Gonads produce sex hormones, and they are steroid hormones. That means they're lipid-based. Testes produce testosterone, and that's the main androgen, as we mentioned briefly before. And they're triggering the sperm production, growth and development of testes and the penis, increased skeletal and muscle growth, and enlargement of the larynx, and increase in body hair. And on the other hand, the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone, and they cause an increase in development of the breast tissue, redistribution of fat towards the hips and legs and the breasts, the maturation of the uterus, the vagina, and the regulation of egg production. In pregnancy, then, these hormones manage and prepare the body systems for carrying and birthing the offspring. All right, so that's a brief overview going through the endocrine system, teaching us about hormones. And now we're going to start tackling the locomotive system, the movement apparatus, and we'll start with the skeleton.